One death every 15 minutes. That is how many people succumb to drug-resistant infections in the United States, and many, many more are suffering around the world. You're watching Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. Increasing numbers of people are becoming resistant to life-saving antibiotics. What once worked often no longer does. And there's more than just a human price to pay.
In 1945, Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, warned of the danger of over-reliance on antibiotics, with the threat of bacteria developing resistance. Today, to an extent, his fears have been realised. Public Health England recently said there are 165 new antibiotic-resistant infections every day in England. Nearly 3 million people in the US suffer from drug-resistant infections annually, leading to more than 35,000 deaths. That's one every 15 minutes. Complications from drug-resistant infections will cost the world up to $100 trillion by 2050, according to a UK government study. So with the emergence of new drug-resistant infections, what are the solutions?
Let's get the conversation going. At the Roundtable today, Professor Clare Chandler, Director of the Antimicrobial Resistance Centre, in charge of a team of researchers around the world. Dr. Lena Ciric is here, an environmental microbiologist. She believes we need to diagnose infections better and come up with new antibiotics. Dr. Elisabeth Adams with us, Managing Director and founder of Aquarius Population Health, gathering evidence around the world about the use of antibiotics, and Tagbo Niepa, Professor of Bioengineering, who got exposed to microbial multi-drug resistance in 2001 and has been looking into it ever since. Not every moment of the day, Tagbo, I'm sure, but it's pretty much a lifelong passion so far. Listen, you are all experts in this field. There is no doubt that we are using too many antibiotics. I think I'm right in saying that. The question is why, how do we stop it, and what do we do about it when it comes to fighting infections? And evidence, Lena, of how much this has invaded our daily lives can be found just outside our back door, a few hundred yards away in the muddy old Thames.
Yeah, not just in the muddy old Thames, which has lots of sewage works, or the treated water from sewage works going into it, but also in the Serpentine, the Regent's Park pond, where we just have ducks and other animals, other waterfowl. So really it's a case of these antibiotics, but also the bacteria that are resistant to them and the genes that cause the resistance being found pretty much everywhere.
How are they getting there?
They get there through various means, so it really depends on where we are. But ultimately, we've been using antibiotics a lot. That gets into our water systems.
We've been eating animals that have been brought up using antibiotics?
Indeed, yeah. A lot of antibiotics are used as growth promoters for the rearing of cattle, so not to treat infections, but actually just to make them bigger so that we can get more meat off them. So, yeah, in our agricultural practices, in our water systems.
Yeah, anybody can jump in at any time, but I'd throw this one at you. I've got to pick the right person for this one. How does what we've heard from Lena demonstrate that perhaps we are becoming resistant to or the microbes in our body are becoming resistant to the antibiotics?
So antibiotic resistance is emerging because of the amount of antibiotics that we are using across a lot of different systems. And so we end up not being able to treat infections that would once have been possible to treat with the first-line antibiotics and having to move on to the next-line antibiotic. And in some settings, that's fine when we've got next-line antibiotics. And I think the reason that we haven't addressed this for a long time is that we've had more antibiotics to go on to. But now we're in a situation where we have very few alternatives, even in places like the UK, where we have a lot of next-line antibiotics. One of the places that I do a lot of work is in East Africa. And here we often don't have recourse to the next line antibiotics. So already if you have a drug-resistant infection, then you're already in a position of acute problem.
But what about those of us, luckily enough, in the more developed world, as opposed to East Africa? Are we running out, and therefore there's a dead end coming? Unfortunate use of words, but that's perhaps what it is.
That's the analysis that people are putting forward, is that there are an increasing number of cases in which there are no antibiotics left to treat those patients. And being able to test those patients to check which antibiotics they're susceptible to is also a challenge, even in our high-income settings.
This isn't the first programme we've done about it, and there was very little optimism, I have to say, in one of the other ones we did. So I want to get into sort of where we can go, and Tagbo, that'll be one of the things that we talk about with you. But why would you say, Elisabeth, that new antibiotics are not being developed? Is it just too costly, waste of money, firms think?
I think it's really complicated, actually. It's not just any one thing. The problem is it's a really complex system. And I think one of the big frustrations is we actually do have tools now, they're called diagnostic tests, which we can use to help determine which people should have an antibiotic or even which antibiotic they should have. But these aren't being used regularly enough. So, for example, you might go to the GP and it looks like you have the flu or a cold or don't know what, and they give you antibiotics rather than using a test which can actually determine what best clinical care is to prevent unnecessary
So they
use.
could do that, but they don't because it's too expensive to have this kind of diagnostic equipment, or they are just in a habit of not bothering?
Again, it's quite complex. The funding mechanisms for diagnostics is not straightforward. Where, for example, there's tariffs for what you should pay for a drug. We don't have the same thing for diagnostics in this country. So many other countries do. They know that if they go to give a flu test, they'll get reimbursed, I don't know, 20 euros. But in this country, we don't have the same mechanism at a national level. Some regions are putting that in place, but it's not universal. So there's not the way to pay for this, particularly in primary care. But also, doctors don't necessarily know these things are
But what
available.
about the drugs companies themselves? There are some brilliant scientists there, some great medical professionals. Why aren't they coming up with something and saying, this is the answer? It occurs to me there are two reasons, perhaps. One is that it costs an awful lot of money to get to that particular point. And the second possibility is that they don't know. They don't know what to do because they've never encountered this before.
Well, again, it comes back to funding in a lot of regards, because if they know that they're going to bring a drug to market and it's going to cost millions and millions of pounds, but that people don't know how to value that new antibiotic, because at the moment we might not need it, but in 5, 10, 20 years we will, that antibiotic might be worth, I don't know, £100, £500, £1,000. And so therefore you can invest that much up front to pay for it. But at the moment, if you can go to the pharmacy and get a pack of azithromycin for £1 or less.
The problem is they don't work. Perhaps.
Not all the time.
Tagbo, let me come to you, because we're talking about, let's do a couple of acronyms here. Yeah. We've got AMR, antimicrobial resistance, and we've got hospital-acquired infections, HAI. One of the biggest problems we have is that people go to hospitals to get better and they actually get worse because they pick up these very severe conditions, these HAIs. Yeah. Your company, your belief is that your company will be able to produce something that reduces these infections in hospitals by sterilizing in a certain way that isn't being done up till now. Is that a fair analysis?
I think prevention is the best line of defense when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, because as you just mentioned, you go to the hospital because you have maybe a very benign infection, but at the end of the day, all the medication that you receive are broad-spectrum antibiotic that can even kill your good germs. So because you no longer have your good germs, then you'll be exposed to some pathogen that were dormant in your system, and then they will start causing more trouble at the end. And this is the case for C. difficile infection, for instance.
So what sort of things are you looking at developing?
So
to make hospitals, if you like, safer places?
Correct.
And
so
everywhere?
We want an environment where people can safely go to the hospital and get treated for the exact disease that you have. So we're thinking about some automations, some automated sterilization system, where basically the door handle even could be wiped and sterilized before the next patient come and touch it. Or even if you think about an emergency room, for instance, that has been hosting maybe a patient that has a multi-drug resistant infection, we want to find a way to sterilize that after the patient is gone. So I think these kind of methods are mostly preventive, but at the same time, they prevent cross-contamination, which is...
And equally, you could have bandages that were initially sterilized. You could have nurses' uniforms, janitors' uniforms that had this antimicrobial, anti-resistance, if you like, built into it.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get at is, if we're not developing new drugs for whatever reason, is this the way forward, prevention?
There are lots of ways forward, I think. I think for the more, more sterile equipment within hospitals, I think that's definitely something to strive for. But there's only so much that we can design. So we can design these amazing products, but it's also about training people how to use them. So making sure that when you're supposed to change your sterile gown between patients, make sure you do that. You're supposed to change your gloves between patients, make sure you do that. So it's also about training people as well, and people, clinical staff, I guess, in the hospital's context, understanding how resistance works and why it's important that they do the things that at the moment they might perceive as being told to do.
I think one of the challenges we quite often see is that there might be guidelines, so national guidelines. People then create local guidelines, and then when you actually speak to people, clinicians, let's say in a hospital, they say, oh, there's a guideline, but I don't follow it for whatever reason. And I think this is very challenging, because we can have the best intentions and put out best evidence and things like that. But if people aren't going to follow it, if there isn't a system in place to make sure people are following it, what are we going to do? So again, I think it's very much down to education and having people understand why it's important.
But what about this other idea? Okay, yeah.
I was just going to say that I think education is part of it, but a lot of people know, a lot of the healthcare professionals know why they should do certain things.
Well,
and a lot of the
otherwise
reasons,
they shouldn't really be healthcare professionals,
exactly. And so a lot of the reasons that we do things, whether it's prescribing decisions or hygiene decisions, is based on a lack of time. And time is something that's really important across the spectrum of why we use so many antibiotics. So I do think the point about prevention is really important. If we keep just making new antibiotics, we're going to put them into a sinking ship. So we need to deal with why we're using so many antibiotics. And our research shows that antibiotics are being used as a quick fix and propping up a system where people aren't investing enough time in patient care. They aren't investing enough time in hygiene. People aren't able to take the time off work to get better, so they're using antibiotics. And I think,
But there is still this thing, and we'll get back to what we can do about the fact that these microbes are resistant to the drugs in just a moment. But let's go back to what Tagbo was saying. Lister, wasn't it, invented sterilization or made it very professional in hospitals. But this is an advanced form of what he developed, isn't it? It's effectively like putting up a barrier to bugs so they don't get in there in the first place, rather than cleaning them before they do. Is that a really good way forward? So people don't end up having to take the antibiotics in the first place.
I think there's a ton of innovations that are being developed that
throw
are
a few out.
fantastic. I mean, so I think this is a great way. I think there's companies who are developing microfilms you put on surgical equipment or implants, even catheters, simple things like this, so the bugs then won't grow. So that's a great way. But again, there's an issue with price, there's an issue with adoption. So I think you can have, there's a huge amount of research funding, particularly in the UK. I mean, they do a great job in this country of actually investing in research around AMR, but around medical and health in general. But if we don't have the mechanisms to get it adopted, we're not going to be using...
But isn't that sort of... Can I just throw this one out there?
Sure.
That is sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, isn't it? Because I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, it isn't just humans that pay the price. There is an economic cost as well. And if you invest in this, and if it saves lives, then you save yourselves money. Sorry, I'll discuss that in just a moment, but you wanted to say
Yeah, but I want to mention that there's not only like one single way to solve this problem. Antibiotic has been the major way to solve antibiotic-resistant infection today. But when we think about the way that things are moving forward, it's more likely that we'll be stuck with no antibiotic at some point. So coming with a complementary approach that's going to innovate with prevention, but also some alternative technology that are completely disruptive. Like some of the work that we do in my lab currently, we're focusing on using electrochemical currents. So the current that you use to power most of your devices to weaken the ability of bacteria and yeast to resist to antimicrobials. So all these things...
So you'd be effectively using electricity to make the antibiotic more effective.
Exactly. So because it does not distinguish between which one have the dormant cells or which one have the more resistant cells, it does affect the cell membrane and the cell walls in the same manner that you would think most of the antibiotics should be working today. But so by delivering this low level of electrochemical current, you can open some pores on the cells and then allow anything that is toxic to the cells to enter and to disrupt those cells. So we're trying to see that as a complementary technique because we don't want to be stuck to a point where we do not longer have any antibiotic and there's no way to solve infections.
Okay, so it seems to me like it's the old Verve song, isn't it? The drugs don't work. And you've got to look for something else.
It's getting there, isn't it?
But a lot of them work now. I mean, this is the thing. It's not
For
that
now.
we're now in a situation where none of them work. I mean, a lot of them work, but we're not making the right decisions about which drugs to give to whom.
Yes.
I think we come back to this time and time again. You need antibiotics
Yeah.
for different infections, but
Can I pick up on the point about the pharmaceutical industry?
Hmm.
So we talked
Well, the
a
idea
little
that
bit.
if there's not a lot of money in it for them, then they won't bother.
Yeah, basically, because ultimately what they want to invest their resources in is drugs that we'll be taking for the rest of our lives, not something that's going to be very effective and work within 5 days, 7 days, and that's it. Really, the best antibiotic is one that you don't take often and that you take for a short time, but that's not profitable.
You're being
And
cynical.
should our healthcare, should the health of the human population be dictated by profits?
That's
I
another
don't think
programme.
so.
No, I quite agree with you, but of course it is, isn't it? And then, one of the unanswerables in this country is how can we ever afford to have the health service, but equally, how can we ever afford not to have the health
Yeah.
service? No government will ever sort that one out.
I wanted to mention about, although I think it's really important to develop technologies and new technologies to address this problem, I do think we already have some really basic things that we can do that we're not investing in, really basic systems. And I think one of the interesting things, if you observe the way that we've been trying to address AMR, is that it has been addressed as a technological problem. There are political reasons that we end up using antibiotics to prop up our systems. If we did invest more in basic measures, basic hygiene, if we actually, if we trained cleaners in a different way, if we allowed time, if we allowed more time for GPs in their consultations, if we allowed more time for people to
You're still not
recover.
addressing the ultimate problem, which is that you're buying everybody more time, and fewer people would probably get ill. But at the same time, the drugs don't work.
Well, if you get ill less frequently, we have a lower burden of infection.
Yeah.
And AMR is just a proportion of that overall burden of infection. Your best way of dealing with AMR is by reducing the overall burden of infection. So if we were able to take a more sober look at the amount of infection we've got and reduce that with regular measures that we already know how to do, but that's not as interesting in terms of technological development. But a lot of places around the world, if we just simply implemented the tools that we've got, our mops for hygiene, a lot of places we don't have basic sanitation, we don't have basic infrastructure. And even in this country, people are strapped for time and strapped for resources to do the basic things. And looking at the amount of investment that has gone into technology for AMR, if that could be used, if an equivalent amount was put into the very basic things that we know can prevent infection, we would be doing a lot better on AMR.
Starting to feel a little
Again,
bit better now, so it's not the end of the world necessarily.
Yeah, again, I would have to follow up with that because it's true, technology should come as maybe a way to reinforce the fight against antimicrobial resistance. But when we think about basically where the issue is at this point, it looks like everybody seems to be involved in that process and could make that process be better. For instance, everybody could at least wash their hand and do the basic hygiene that is required. This is our personal level, how we can avoid antimicrobial resistant infection. But again, when you move toward the government, as he was mentioning, sanitation, all these things, for political reasons sometimes, the fight could be impeded somehow. So the responsibility is really at different level, and each one of us has his part to play in that role, and maybe the technology that we're trying to develop are only complementary.
What do you think about the idea of, we mentioned it at the top, and I've got a note here that says we use too much and we use too much in animals. Now, animal use of antibiotics is done as just a natural growing process, isn't it? As they're fattening them up for the market, they give them antibiotics to stop them perhaps catching something in the future. And that is a major issue, isn't it?
The evidence on growth promotion is not strong. The evidence that antibiotics actually help to grow animals is not very strong, but they are used as a growth promoter in some places, not in this country. A number of countries in the EU have stopped growth promotion antibiotic use altogether. In fact, we've really, really reduced antibiotic use in farming within the EU. And we still see some rise of antibiotic resistance in hospitals. Yeah. In this setting, it's not entirely clear that there is a strong link between antibiotic use in animals and humans in the UK.
Except, of course, meat in the United States, originally from the US. This is allowed to some extent, and that meat is exported. What do you think about the argument that this isn't really anything to get too worried about?
No, I don't think that's not at all what she said. I think it is.
It definitely is in other places.
I think we do need to be worried about it. The thing is, when, as researchers, for example, we get asked to do these very small little projects on one little thing around antimicrobial resistance. And the thing is, it's a big problem. It's really complex, and there's lots of different players. There's lots of different influencers, and we need to think about things much more holistically. So, and antibiotics in animals is a problem, maybe not in the UK, but certainly in other areas. Antibiotics in the environment is a big problem. I think we need to kind of take a step back and make sure people are working together. So there are groups, such as the one at London School, which are taking this very top-level view, but we need to do more of this as well. I think people get very, very focused on their one research area.
But we haven't got time. Equally, we haven't got time not to, I suppose.
Yeah, we do, though.
I do think that the problem with animals, feeding them antibiotics, is not really much of a major issue, really, when it comes to building this kind of multi-drug resistant infection, just because we can even make our germs stronger by just feeding them little amount of drug that we're supposed to use to treat them. For instance, you're sick and then you receive an antibiotic treatment, and instead of taking that for the whole length of the treatment, you just take that partly. And this is the way that you feed the bacteria and teach them how they should develop the resistance that you don't want at the end of the day. So it could be our own errors that we really need to follow up on every single treatment that the doctor prescribes us and make sure that we eradicate these infections.
Okay, so we must follow doctor's orders.
That's a bit overly simplistic. I think that there are so many different species of bacteria, so many different types of antibiotics. So in some cases, yes, if you expose a particular species to small amounts of an antibiotic, eventually they do become resistant. But actually, that's not. Yeah, it's not quite as simple as it'll learn. Yeah. But also the other thing that's been happening more and more is that people have been picking up what we call zoonotic infections, so picking up infections from agricultural animals, from companion animals, and then once we have those infections, if they are resistant and if the animals have been exposed to a lot of antibiotics they're more likely to be, then we are also
So there is an animal element to it, but it's not necessarily the fact that the animals were fed antibiotics when they were being fattened.
Ultimately, we still don't know enough to be able to say
well,
yes or no to that.
We've only got 5 more minutes and we're trying to solve the problems of the world medically here. What has to be done immediately? I'll just go around. Claire, you first.
I think we have to address the way that we're using antibiotics as a quick fix. And that means paying attention to the things that we're fixing with antibiotics. And that would be, we're fixing the way that we do care by providing antibiotic as a substitute for actually caring for people. We're fixing the way that we do hygiene by giving antibiotics instead of the longer process of doing a rigorous hygiene regime. We're fixing the way that we enable production of animals by using antibiotics. We're fixing inequality by using antibiotics. And if we look at those things that we're fixing and try to fix those, we won't need to use as many antibiotics.
Okay, things we all know but should be doing better.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't think there's one thing we need to do. I think there are many things we need to do globally. So, yeah.
If we get the new drugs, and the new drugs after that, and the new drugs after that, could we then go back to the original ones? Because the resistance would have gone.
Absolutely. So lots of bugs are actually still sensitive to things like penicillin. So we just need to be able to detect which ones we can use, and then we can conserve the antibiotics that we have. I mean, that's one of the major things we can do right now, is more rational use of the drugs. Use diagnostics. Inform patients, inform clinicians. It's simple things that don't cost that much money to do, but we need to implement those now. And I agree, you don't necessarily need innovation. There's a lot of things you can do to tackle the problem now.
Okay.
And really what we need, though, is we need some sort of a celebrity, like we have for other diseases, to be the face of AMR and to really help promote this. I don't know which one we're going to choose, but it would be great to have one.
Well, you must have somebody in mind. The face of
I'm sure
drug
you do.
resistance. I'm not sure it's necessarily hugely appealing. Tagbo, thank you. You've flown in from the States. I wish I could give you more time, but we wish you the very best of luck
Thank you.
with all of the work that you're doing. I mean, you're there not only to perhaps make a little bit of money at the end, but to do good for humankind
That's correct.
at the end of the day. Thank you very much
Pleasure.
indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming in, and thank you for watching the programme. It's not quite as bad as perhaps I thought at the beginning of it all, but the best thing to do is take your vitamin C, go for a few runs and stay healthy. Don't get in hospital in the first place. From me, David Foster, from my guests and from the team that put this together. Thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.